Hello everyone, my name is Trnka and I'm a Deputy Head of the OECD Regulatory Policy Division. I would like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to present here the main conclusion of a review of regulatory policy in Thailand that we carried out as the OECD in cooperation with the Office of the Council of State in 2024 and that was published earlier this year. Thailand has been implementing good regulatory practices into its regulatory landscape since the introduction of the Constitution in 2017. I would like to in particular highlight the 2019 Act on Legislative Drafting and Evaluation of Law that established the Office of the Council of State as the regulatory oversight body and introduced several important regulatory management tools such as Regulatory Impact Assessment or RIA as we like to call it. We as the OECD were able to witness this for the first time in 2020 when, as part of the first Thailand country program, we carried out a diagnostic scan of Thailand's regulatory management and oversight reforms. Following this report, Thailand has made really encouraging progress in implementing regulatory policy and regulatory management reforms. Namely, in 2021, the government introduced a so-called Central Law Portal that centralizes all communications with stakeholders and all public consultations to one place. Also, in 2023, the RIA requirement was extended to basically all secondary and subordinate regulations that might affect people and or businesses. And also, in the meantime, over 200 ex-post reviews of the existing stock of regulations have been conducted, with many resulting in improvements to the current stock of legislation. Despite the significant process in implementing good regulatory practices, our recent review that was carried out as part of the second OECD Thailand country program was able to identify remaining gaps and challenges in implementing regulatory policy into Thailand's regulatory policy landscape. This review provided an opportunity to fine-tune Thailand's regulatory framework in order to ensure it is aligned with Thailand's overall development strategy, but also with the OECD and international best practices. It identified remaining gaps in Thailand's regulatory framework and the practical application of its reforms. Provides recommendations for further improvements in key areas such as ex-ante regulatory impact assessment, stakeholder engagement, ex-post reviews of the existing stock of regulations, and regulatory enforcement. But let me start first with the overall governance structure for regulatory policy in Thailand. There, Thailand has also made substantial progress, including requiring the parliament to conduct regulatory impact assessment for legislative proposals, strengthening the oversight role of the OCS, or implementing the regulatory guillotine and expanding ex-post reviews through the Law Commission. However, we still provided some recommendations on improving the overall governance structure. We felt that there is a strong commitment to evidence-based participatory decision-making through broader adoption of RIA and stakeholder consultations, but we think that this commitment should be further strengthened, for example, through developing a better regulation action plan, which would include clear targets and deadlines to help outline the necessary steps needed for cultural change in regulatory policy making, and facilitate regular reporting to the Prime Minister's office, the Parliament, and the general public. This would be connected to enhancing monitoring and evaluation schemes to promote effective implementation of regulatory policy reform and maintaining transparency and accountability. Also, we think that the oversight role of the OCS should be further strengthened and coordination across the government should improve, for example, through establishing a position of so-called better regulation leaders within line ministries and other agencies to help in mainstreaming GRPs across departments, and also creating an informal better regulation network to exchange ideas and experiences across various services in the executive. The next chapter speaks about the process of developing new laws and legislation, and specifically about ex-ante regulatory impact assessment that has been implemented since 2019 and has advanced throughout the administration. And while the general knowledge across the administration about what is regulatory impact assessment and why it is important is quite good, we feel that the awareness about the goals, the methods, the objectives of regulatory impact assessment should still be strengthened, including maybe through publications of annual reports on RIA outcomes. Again, the supervisory role, the oversight role of the OCS should be further strengthened, and OCS should be given the necessary powers to request further study and evidence from ministries. It is very important that RIA is undertaken very early in the policy process, and that it brings in more stringent guidelines on the assessment. What would help in this aspect would be implementing a forward legislative planning process and proportionality framework that would help to better plan ex-ante RIAs, but also to target and allocate scarce resources to the most significant draft laws and regulations with the most significant impacts. When it comes to engaging with stakeholders in the process of developing or reviewing laws and regulations, I've already mentioned the establishment of the Central Law Portal, which was a significant step forward in better engagement with stakeholders in the process of developing new regulations. Since its introduction, the portal saw over 877 consultation projects. On top of that, the Secretariat of the Parliament has also created its own public consultation portal to enhance stakeholder engagement process at the parliamentary level. But we still see further opportunities to enhance elements of Thailand's stakeholder engagement framework, including extending the minimum consultation period to make sure that stakeholders have sufficient time to provide feedback and to organize themselves, especially when it includes business associations or larger umbrella organizations. Just in the case of RIA, we think that the oversight of engagement practices and also the scope of consultations could be strengthened to make sure that the diversity of perspectives is taken into account, but also to enable a monitoring and reporting system about public consultations, to keep track of the type and number of public consultations and their quality. I've already mentioned the importance of introducing a forward legislative planning system. This would also help with planning consultations and sharing these plans with outside stakeholders to support their preparation and participation in the process. Sometimes publishing legislative drafts online and receiving comments at the end of the process might not be enough. Therefore, we feel that new innovative methods of stakeholder engagement should be used, especially early in the legislation making process, to help with their engagement. The next chapter speaks about the reviews of the existing stock of regulations, the ex-post reviews. And again, while these ex-post reviews have been successfully integrated into Thailand's regulatory framework, there are still some challenges that remain, including unclear links between the ex-ante process and the ex-post reviews, or the absence of a proportionality principle to prioritize reviews. In this aspect, we specifically recommend to adopt more resource-efficient approach to carrying out ex-post reviews, to really focus on the most significant regulations, the most burdensome ones, where the opportunities for significantly reducing unnecessary regulatory burdens could be relatively high. Also, we feel that analytical resources should be strengthened in individual ministries, because those ex-post reviews require certain analytical skills that might be rather scarce in some parts of the administration. We think that the link between the ex-ante regulatory impact assessment and ex-post evaluation should be strengthened, ensuring clear data gathering strategies and financial resources. In the medium term, The Thai administration may also upgrade its system of ex-post reviews and its practices by, for example, defining and enforcing clear guidance quality standards for evaluation planning, designing, and management. Also, we think that establishing a multi-stakeholder groups accompanying and overseeing major evaluations could be an important step forward. And also linking the findings from at least major ex-post reviews to the programming and planning of new government legislative initiatives should be strengthened and could be useful in better legislative planning. The final chapter focuses on regulatory delivery, the way regulations are being implemented, enforced, and how governments make sure that those regulations are complied with, because regulations that are not complied with will hardly achieve their objectives. However, regulatory delivery does not seem to be a firm part of the better regulation toolbox in Thailand. This is a situation that is very similar to many OECD countries, as regulatory delivery is probably the newest area of regulatory policy. This is why we recommend to Thailand to develop a whole government policy on regulatory delivery and enforcement. Thai government should incorporate risk-based approaches to inspections and compliance monitoring. It should also strengthen coordination across inspection agencies to improve enforcement efficiency. Overall, regulatory enforcement and delivery should be aligned with the OECD best practice principles to regulatory enforcement and inspections to ensure that regulatory objectives are systematically met. Ladies and gentlemen, this was a very quick overview of the main conclusions and recommendations stemming from our regulatory policy review of Thailand. Looking ahead, we think that good regulatory practices must be implemented progressively and continuously, taking into the account the capacities of the administration and also practical constraints. Moving forward, the OECD, and in particular the Regulatory Policy Division of the OECD, remain committed to supporting Thailand in further strengthening its regulatory framework. Areas for future collaboration might include regulatory delivery and enforcement, inspection mechanisms, and the continued development of a comprehensive regulatory governance framework. We could also work together on strengthening the framework and guidance for ex-post reviews of the existing stock of regulations. Strengthening these efforts will not only enhance the effectiveness of Thailand's regulatory environment, but will also contribute to its broader economic and social development goals. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention.
Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be presenting to you today. My name is Supriya Trivedi, and I'm a policy analyst at the OECD's Regulatory Policy Division. I'll be presenting today on the OECD policy paper, Introducing Proportionality to Thailand's Regulatory Impact Assessment Framework. This was published alongside the OECD's Regulatory Policy Review of Thailand. To begin the presentation, I would like to start by defining what we actually mean by proportionality for RIA. As we are aware, regulatory impact assessments, or RIAs, play a crucial role in enhancing regulatory quality. They serve as a systematic approach for assessing the potential consequences, both positive and negative, of proposed regulations before they are enacted. One of the principal benefits of RIA is that they foster evidence-based policymaking. However, it is essential to acknowledge that not every regulation warrants the same level of scrutiny or analytical depth. A one-size-fits-all approach may not be practical or efficient, especially given the constraints that many governments face in terms of time, capacity, and financial resources. Therefore, a critical challenge lies in striking an appropriate balance between the available resources and the expected outcomes of the regulation's impact. In this way, the proportionality principle helps and refers to the point that the depth, scope, and detail of the RIA should be proportional to the significance of the anticipated impacts of the proposed regulation, and its goal of the principle is to ensure that public resources, such as staff time, staff capacity, and expertise, are used efficiently and effectively. In terms of the objective of the proportionality principle, there are four main goals. First is to prioritize efforts on regulatory proposals that warrant in-depth analysis. One of the primary functions of proportionality and thresholds test is to help RIA oversight bodies allocate their resources effectively. These tests act as filters, ensuring that attention and analytical depth are reserved for proposals with potentially significant impacts. This targeted approach ensures efficiencies and helps avoid unnecessary administrative burdens on minor or low-risk regulations. Second, guide the selection of appropriate analytical tools. Proportionality assessments assist in determining which analytical method is most suitable for a given regulatory proposal. Not every regulation requires the same level of analysis. The choice between tools like cost-benefit analysis, cost-effective analysis, or risk analysis should be driven by the expected complexity and nature of the impacts. This ensures that the analysis is fit for purpose and supports better decision-making. It can also help prevent against, for example, consultation fatigue by ensuring that the right stakeholders are contacted for better policy outcomes. Third, it signals the need for a comprehensive RIA and ensures timely involvement of oversight bodies and other national authorities. These tests serve as an early warning mechanism to identify proposals that may require a full and detailed RIA. Early identification allows the necessary national institutions or expert bodies to become involved from the outset rather than being brought in late to the process. This proactive involvement also helps avoid delays, ensures regulatory quality, and improves overall coordination. And finally, it enhances the quality and consistency of the RIA report to better support policymaking. By ensuring that the level of analysis matches the significance of the proposed regulation, proportionality tests contribute to producing high-quality, credible RIA reports. These reports are more likely to be consistent, effective, and useful as decision-making tools. Ultimately, the proportionality principle strengthens the overall regulatory process and supports the build trust in policy outcomes. Regarding the types of proportionality tests, well, first and foremost, it's important to restate that proportionality refers to the depth of analysis required and threshold refers to what triggers the level of assessment. That being said, one of the key considerations is the economic context. In this case, the economic context of a country plays an important role in defining these two aspects. For example, a country with a small economy could have a smaller economic threshold that triggers a comprehensive lawmaking process in comparison to a country with a larger economy or population. Thereby, the notion of proportionality and threshold will always need to be tailored for a specific country, and setting an adequate threshold will be important for Thailand should they consider moving forward with this system. In terms of the type of proportionality test, the tiered approach, so taking a light RIA, so a lighter assessment at the beginning of the regulatory making process, and then potentially adapting it to a more full and in-depth RIA, is particularly useful when there are several stages in the regulatory making process. The framework of assessments of a proportionality test can be structured through 4 different ways. The first is a total impact quantitative test that looks at the level of depth of analysis and is dependent on the total impacts to society. The second is a multi-criteria test, so that means that the depth of RIA is based on a mix of quantitative and qualitative criteria in a number of key areas. The third is a single issue test, so the analytical depth of a RIA is based on impacts to one sector or stakeholder group. And finally, there's the discretionary with oversight test, which considers that the policymaker undertakes a preliminary RIA and then a regulatory oversight body will help to determine the level of analysis based on that preliminary analysis taken by the policymaker. And then finally, it's also important to understand when exemptions could be carried out within the regulatory policymaking system. So this means when a regulatory proposal could overall bypass the RIA procedure in response to, for example, an emergency. This typically responds to the idea that more damage could be done to society if a regulation is not imposed than if we go through the entire process of analyzing all the impacts. That being said, it is always very important that a post-implementation review is taken of any draft law or regulation that is implemented without an ex-ante assessment. There are some general recommendations that the OECD has made towards countries that are interested in implementing the system of proportionality and thresholds in their own context. as part of their RIA framework. So some of the general recommendations to stem from this report are first that policymakers should define the scope of a policy at the earliest stage. At this point, it is essential to start the proportionality assessment at the earliest stage, specifically when policymakers are still evaluating the policy problem. Second, it is to ensure that there's a clear problem definition. The regulatory oversight body should first confirm that the policy problem is properly identified and accurately assessed. And this assessment should be done early when there is maximum flexibility to shape the regulatory or policy approach. The third is to align efforts with the scale of impact. The amount of time and resources devoted to a regulation and its analysis should be proportional to the expected size of the impacts. Considerations in this respect could be given to the structure and size of the economy, as mentioned earlier, impacts per capita, the flexibility of the policy approach, and the relative capacity of the government to implement and monitor the regulation. Fourth is that regulations that bypass the RIA process in true emergencies should always undergo a post-implementation process to ensure that the regulation is actually serving its policy outcomes. And finally, the level of analysis and oversight should also be taken into account of existing capacities within government, and that government should adapt their system to making sure that it is balanced with its institutional capacity. Building off of these general recommendations from the OECD and making more specific recommendations for Thailand, the OECD recommends applying a triage system to triage system would operate. It could be supported by a triage questionnaire. There is a sample of what this questionnaire could look like in the entire report, which is sometimes referred to as a light RIA. This tool would enable policymakers to conduct an early and systematic screening of proposed regulations. To implement the triage system and to build the triage questionnaire, it would require Thailand to make considerations towards three main aspects. First and foremost, it would be about defining the threshold. What should the threshold be to spark the need for a more advanced and in-depth RIA? The second would be to consider what the criteria would be for automatic exemptions from the RIA process altogether. And third, it would be to look at what the criteria should be that policymakers should use to either quantitatively or qualitatively assess the levels of impact of a proposed regulations and determine what the scope of evaluation would be thereafter. This level of information would then be used as part of the triage questionnaire and would help to filter when further resources should be allocated within the system to take a more comprehensive and fuller RIA to support the evidence-based policymaking system of Thailand. In general, and to provide a little bit of background of why this system is being proposed for Thailand, is because the OECD understood that the Thai administration has been under considerable pressure to perform and treat all draft laws with the same degree of scrutiny, regardless of their relative importance or impact. And generally, when we're looking at international experience, it suggests that full RIAs might not constitute more than 5 to 10% of overall RIAs carried out by a government in a year. To help showcase how the has light impacts, or if a regulatory proposal is deemed to have high impacts. So let me quickly walk you through the different options that the process map provides. The first is if the regulatory proposal is being requested for an exemption. In this case, the ministry would develop a triage questionnaire. From there, they would send the triage questionnaire to the Office of Cabinet, who would share the questionnaire with OCS. And from there, OCS would provide an opinion verifying the exemption. If OCS agreed with the exemption, then the outcome would be that a RIA would not be required and that the policy is developed and implemented. If OCS did not agree with the exemption, then it would lead OCS to communicate back to the ministry to re-examine the estimated impacts. The second option is if the regulatory proposal was considered to have low impacts. In this case, the ministry would once again develop the triage questionnaire. From there, would submit the questionnaire to the Office of Cabinet, who would submit it to OCS. And OCS would provide an opinion on the low impacts that are claimed. If OCS agrees that the proposal indeed has low impacts, then the outcome would be, again, not to conduct a more comprehensive RIA. In the case that OCS disagrees with the low impact, then it would lead to having a more comprehensive dialogue with the ministry that developed the original triage questionnaire and to examine the data that it used. If OCS was convinced that indeed the proposal had low impacts, then it could then suggest that no further RIA or maybe a more lighter RIA would be taken. And if OCS was not convinced, then it would lead to the idea that a more full RIA would have to be taken out. And finally, the most straightforward option is that if a ministry already determined that a regulatory proposal would have high impacts, it would potentially develop a triage questionnaire, but otherwise it would just go ahead to then develop a full RIA. Finally, before concluding the presentation, I would also like to showcase how the principle of proportionality could be equally relevant and beneficial for ex post reviews of existing regulations. As mentioned in the OECD best practice principles for the review of the stock of regulation, jurisdictions are encouraged to conduct systematic and program reviews, particularly for regulations identified as having high impact. Therefore, in the context of Thailand, this means that the same proportionality standard used during the ex ante phase should be carried forward into the ex post review process. And to support with this, the OECD offers 3 considerations in the report for 3 different scenarios. So the first is for regulations that were subject to a full RIA, given the basis that they were already noted as being high impact. In this case, that high impact status would translate over into the post-implementation review, and the regulation would undergo a similar comprehensive review after implementation. The second is for regulations introduced prior to the adoption of proportionality-based assessments. So, for example, the current stock of regulations in Thailand. In this case, the responsible agency could apply a triage questionnaire retroactively, specifically for the purpose of ex post reviews, and suggest what the level of assessment should be. From there, the completed questionnaire would be submitted to the Office of the Council of State for verification, which would then help to determine the appropriate level of analysis and resources needed in the upcoming review cycle. And the final scenario is the proportionality-based approach could also be applied to emergency regulations, which were exempt from the ex ante assessment stage. In such cases, a full ex post review schedule could be proposed, for example, either on a 2-year timeline, or, for example, if there was already a sunset clause imposed as part of the emergency regulation. And the triage process could be used to evaluate the impact and determine the necessary level of review of that regulation. In general and overall, integrating proportionality into both ex ante and ex post regulatory processes help to ensure consistency, improve regulatory performances, and support better policy outcomes over time. Overall, and as I now conclude my presentation, I would like to mention that as the title of this report suggests, introducing proportionality to Thailand's regulatory impact assessment framework is about optimizing analytical resources as effectively as possible. I would like to thank you all for listening to this presentation today, and I really hope that I can see you in Bangkok soon. Many thanks.